Good morning, everyone. My name is Yiyue Huang, and I'm a second-year physics student. And this project was supervised by Professor Boswell, Space Plasma Power and Propulsion Group. And today, my topic's about human missions to Mars. In particular, we will look for ways to reduce the cost and entropy in the supply chain from the Earth to Moon and Mars. Entropy, in this case, refers to the state of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty associated with the supply chain needed to support a manned spaceflight. People have been exploring the moon for a very long time, and 12 astronauts have successfully made to the moon's surface. The moon is a start point for manned mission, but definitely not our destination. It can be seen as a preparation for human missions to Mars and beyond. So today, I'm going to talk about various human missions to Mars, and our goal is to reduce the entropy and cost during this mission. I've divided my presentation into 4 sections. In the first section, we will look at a one-way trip to Mars, and in the second section, we will extend it to a return mission. We will look at the trajectory, time constraint, and total cost for these missions. And at the end of the second section, we will also look at the possibility of producing supplies on the surface of Mars. Then in the third section, we will see if that produced supplies on Mars surface idea really saves us a cost or entropy. And we will also investigate an alternative approach, which is the robot mission. And in the last section, we will see if it is possible to use the moon as a stopover point to Mars to reduce cost or entropy, as well as the possibility of producing fuel on the moon's surface. Okay, let's begin. A one-way trip to Mars. It may look relatively easy compared to the return trip, but it is actually much harder than existing human mission to the moon. The main difficulty comes from that the distance between the Earth to Mars is hundreds of times that of the moon, and exploring a planet at a longer distance will cost more and have more difficulties. Here's a graph shows the Earth and Mars orbit. We can see that unlike the moon, which orbits this Earth, Mars moves around the sun, and it is not at the same velocity of Earth, which means the distance between them varies with time. Indeed, the distance between the Earth and Mars can vary from 50 million kilometers to more than 400 million kilometers. The graph shows when they are at their closest distance, roughly, but as you can see that they can actually be very further apart as well. So, by doing some calculation of their orbital periods, we found the time when they reach their minimum distance is about every 780 days, which is more than 2 years, and that does not happen really often. And the best time to say shoot a rocket from the Earth to Mars intuitively is at their closest distance. And this is true and can be done by a mission called fast conjunction mission. However, this is rarely used today since it will depend solely on the fuel it carries to accelerate and decelerate, which will make the rocket much heavier and also increase the cost a lot. Although it is indeed really fast, only takes about 3 to 4 months. So we need to look for a more cost-efficient trajectory, which is the Hohmann transfer orbit. It is an elliptical orbit tangent to 2 circular orbits, and it is presently the most energy-efficient maneuver that allows traveling between 2 circular orbits that share a common focus on the same plane. In this case, the common focus is the Sun, and the lower circular orbit would be our Earth orbit, and the higher one is the Mars. It is energy efficient since theoretically we only need 2 engine plots during the whole mission. One is that we need to accelerate to escape the Earth orbit into the Hohmann transfer orbit, which is from the green line to the yellow line. And the other is that the spacecraft will then need to turn around and accelerate backwards or decelerate to catch the Mars orbit, which is from the yellow line to the red one. Other times we will not use any propellant and are merely just floating on an orbit governed by inertia. And there is no other crazy gravity assistance needed during the whole mission. While minimizing the energy, reducing the fuel need to carry, it has its own drawback, is that it will take around 7 to 10 months, which doubles that of the fast conjunction mission. But we will still go with that since the increased cost of fuel in the fast conjunction mission is considerable, and the Hohmann transfer really saves us a lot. So, for a Hohmann transfer, we can estimate the payload needed for a standard manned mission. We consider the food, water, and oxygen consumed by 3 astronauts in average, and found the minimum weight required for an 8-month trip is around 2.5 tons. And we also have to include other necessary equipment, which increase the total weight for a one-way trip to around 4 tons. Is that a reasonable weight? Well, compared to the parts that Tianwen-1 actually got into the Mars orbit, which was around 5 tons, it seems plausible just for a one-way mission to Mars. But just a very quick note here that the weight as Tianwen-1 launched was about 900 tons, which means 99% of its weight was used for the rocket itself, and mostly the fuel. Okay, let's move on to the next section, where we extend it to a return mission. We will start by looking at the trajectory, and in this case, we will focus on the back trip from Mars to the Earth. We may notice the most fuel-saving route is to take a new Hohmann transfer for the back trip, which is shown on the left-hand side. And it is plausible since if we can take a Hohmann transfer at the first place, we can just wait there until the timing to enter a new Hohmann transfer, then just take the trip backwards, which is represented in the blue line and red line, respectively. However, as mentioned before, that the best time to enter a Hohmann transfer does not happen really often, which means our astronauts will have to wait on Mars surface for a very long time, which we can see is marked in yellow, and that is likely to take more than 500 days, which also increases the total mission time to more than 1,000 days. So another possible trajectory is called the opposition mission trajectory on the right-hand side, which takes the Hohmann transfer for departure and the opposition mission for the back trip. The spacecraft follows the opposition mission trajectory will go around the sun, taking the advantage of the gravitational force of the sun and Venus to speed up, hence also save fuel. The distance taking the opposition mission is longer, but the time we have to wait on Mars will be significantly reduced to about only 50 days. This also decreases our total mission period to about 600 days. So which one to choose? Well, both of these trajectory involves risks. For opposition mission, this involves the intense radiation we may experience when passing by the sun. But this is not as risky as that of the conjunction mission, which spend a much longer time on Mars surface. So, following the opposition mission trajectory and assume our previous estimation of payload is correct, we will need about 10 to 12 tons if we extend the mission time to about 600 days. And in order to send 1 kilogram to Mars, a rocket will likely to burn about 225 kilograms of fuel, which makes the weight of our rocket 2,500 tons, and refers to a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The cost to send 1 kilogram to space is about $2,700, which means the total cost for our trip will be about $6.8 billion, which is extremely expensive. So we have to think of some ways to reduce that. We notice the increased cost comes from the increased payload for the return trip. So one possible approach is to think of producing supplies needed for the return on Mars surface so that we do not have to carry them at the first place. We start by looking at food. Remember that our mission now only involves 15 days on Mars surface. And in general, we are likely to need a longer period to grow plants than just 50 days. So for our mission, it makes more sense to just bring our own food supplies. Water. Mars has a large amount of water ice at its north polar ice caps, and even more water is likely to exist deep underground in the deep subsurface. Here's a graph shows the cold trap for water on Mars' northern lower lands. And the water found there can then be used as supplies after melting and filtering processes. Oxygen. Mars air consists of 96% of carbon dioxide. So in general, oxygen can be extracted using the idea of oxygen concentrator. However, since in this case we have water, we can also consider using the technique of electrolysis of water. The problem is that these techniques require pure water, but the water found on Mars is full of salt. Fortunately, Vijay Ramani and his team has developed a method to extract oxygen and hydrogen directly from briny water, which I'm not going to go through more details here, but you can look it up later if you are interested. Using this method, we can get oxygen, and more importantly, we can also get hydrogen. It becomes very important when it comes to the fuel, which is the biggest cost for our mission. We can consider using methane as a fuel source, then combine the hydrogen and carbon dioxide collected from the Mars air that go through the Sabatier process to produce methane, CH4. And I think this is also what Elon Musk intends to do on Mars surface. All right, it appears that we can get most things required for the return mission on Mars surface. Intuitively, it will save us a lot of costs. But is this really the case? Well, for our mission, our shorter mission, the shorter answer is no, it does not save us any cost or entropy. Let me explain why this is the case. First of all, our mission for now only involves 50 days on Mars, which is not a very long period. And according to our previous estimation, the fuel needed for the return will be about 1,200 tons. And in 15 days, we can only recover about 30 tons at maximum. And this is already a very small portion. Also, to do that, we will need a huge CO2 collector to collect enough carbon dioxide for the Sabatier process. And it is likely to weigh hundreds of kilograms. And remember, to send 1 kilogram to Mars, a rocket will need to burn more than 200 kilograms of fuel. So finally, we found that the fuel produced can barely cancel out the actual fuel required. And it is likely to cost even more due to the issues of the production process on Mars' harsh environment, let alone the increased entropy during those processes. If we extend the mission time on Mars to more than 2,000 days, then we may have the ability to produce enough fuel for the return. However, this is not feasible at this point. Here's a graph shows the simulated Mars environment. We can see that will require our astronauts to produce methane, collect the carbon dioxide, and so on, on a very harsh environment, which involves radiation, extreme sandstorms, and other potential risks. So, since the vulnerability of the human body is a major reason that stops the long-term mission, we can consider an alternative, which is the robot mission. We can envisage sending a robot factory to start dissociating water to produce hydrogen and then the Sabatier process to produce methane. The question is, how long will it take to complete those preparations before we can actually send our astronauts? Well, the tricky part here is that to complete those processes, we will either need solar energy or nuclear thermal reactors to power it. We will first consider the case where we rely on solar energy on Mars. Since Mars is 1.5 AU from the Sun, the solar insolation is 2.25 times less. And with the extreme sandstorms blocking most of the sunlight, the actual solar energy we received will be much, much less than that of the Earth. And a foldable solar panel today weighs 1 kilograms and is 2 square meters large with an efficiency of 20%, but doesn't function at night. The electrolyzer we use today requires 48 kilowatt hour to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And according to Sabatier process, to produce 1 kilogram of methane, we will need 4 kilograms of hydrogen, which means to get 1 kilogram methane, we will need about 200 kilowatt hour. So by doing some calculations of it, we found if we bring 5,000 solar panels, which is already a lot, it will take more than 2 centuries to produce enough fuel for the return. And we can effectively reduce the number to 2 years by bringing 100 times more solar panels. But this is not realistic at this point, since that would increase the weight just for those solar panels to about 1,000 tons. Thus, it is not a very good idea to rely solely on the solar energy on Mars. Next, we consider using the nuclear reactor. On the right is a graph of NASA kilopower nuclear reactor. Each of these devices weighs 1.5 tons, but can only produce a power of 10 kilowatts. So in order to get enough fuel for in 2 years, we will still have to carry hundreds of these devices, which weighs and costs no less than those solar panels. So the best scenario for the rover mission comes if the power of this device can be raised dozens of times. Project Promises proposed an idea to increase the power of this device to more than 400 kilowatts. If we can get that amount of power per device, and of course in a reasonable weight, the rover mission can be accomplished in 10 to 20 years. Okay, finally, we come to the part where we imagine using the moon as a stopover point to Mars. As the moon has much lower gravity than the Earth, its escape velocity is lower, and so we can take advantage of that to send the supplies needed for the return prior to the moon than to Mars. In addition, it will reduce the risk of trying to collect CO2 producing fuel on Mars surface. Let's see if that really works. We will first look at the delta V budget between two different paths. The direct one in red is take the Hohmann transfer as discussed in the first section, and the indirect one in blue, which goes through the moon. During a space mission, the delta V budget estimates the total change in velocity required. So the lower the total delta V, the less energy is needed during a space mission. We can see the delta V budget for the first pass is pretty straightforward, and it is about 20.4 kilometers per second. For the second pass, we use the first and second Lagrange point, EML1 and EML2, for the Earth to Moon and Moon to Mars missions, respectively. The reason to do that is because at the Lagrange points, the gravitational force and the centrifugal force of two larger objects are balanced, which means a little thrust can push a third smaller object to anywhere. In this case, would be our spacecraft, thus minimizing the delta V required. And the total delta V required for the second pass is around 25.5 kilometers per second. So in fact, for a fixed mass of supplies, we would rather send it directly to Mars than using the moon. However, the delta V between the two paths are not significantly different. So we can think of some methods to reduce the fuel needed for the second pass. There is one way to reduce the propellant needed from the Earth to LLO, the low lunar orbit, which is using the concept of Smart 1. Smart 1 was powered by 82 kilograms of xenon-powered Hall effect thrusters, using the electric propulsion to achieve a highly elliptical Earth orbit, which we can see on the graphs are those yellow lines, and finally a moon capture. The launch mass of Smart 1 was about 367 kilograms, with only 20% of its weight was propellant. Thus, reducing the fuel we need to carry, increase the payload, and also decrease the cost. The cost of which was only about $0.13 billion. Although we can effectively reduce the propellant needed from the Earth to LLO, we will still have to carry enough chemical fuel for the escaping and landing process on the moon, as well as from the moon to Mars, which is still considerable. So the question comes, is it possible to produce fuel on the moon surface, like what we envisaged on Mars surface? If that's so, we can effectively reduce the fuel we need to carry from the moon to Mars. So let's first look at what the moon has. The moon has no atmosphere, so we are unlikely to capture oxygen, hydrogen, or carbon dioxide. So the methane cannot be considered as a fuel source anymore, and we have to look for other combinations. Here we will look for two other combinations. One is liquid oxygen with liquid hydrogen, and the other is liquid oxygen with aluminum. We will start by looking at liquid oxygen with liquid hydrogen, which has the highest specific impulse among all other combinations so far. In general, one can get oxygen and hydrogen by electrolyzing water. The moon, however, cannot preserve water, mainly due to its lack of atmosphere and high temperatures during the day. Water will be evaporated immediately. And the only way water could exist as ice is in the permanently shadowed regions, which we can see from the graph are those blue dotted regions. And even so, we can get enough water on the moon surface. The biggest problem from this combination is not the production process, but the storage. This combination is 10 times less dense than other combinations. So we will need a tank 10 times larger to store the same amount of fuel. Moreover, the melting point of liquid hydrogen is at about minus 259.3 degrees, while that of the liquid oxygen is at minus 280.8 degrees, which means when storing them together, we need to separate them completely. Otherwise, the liquid hydrogen will freeze the liquid oxygen. And this again increases the storage space. And bringing such a large tank costs even more than just bringing enough chemical fuel. So let's move on to the next combination, liquid oxygen with aluminum. Oxygen. Since in this case, we do not need hydrogen, we can consider another method to get oxygen, where in this case, we do not have to rely on the assumption that we can get enough water on the moon surface. The solar wind transports oxygen ions from the Earth's atmosphere to the moon, and some portion is implanted. The European Space Agency claimed that they had developed a method for extracting up to 96% of the implanted oxygen from the simulated lunar dust. And this process also involves heating the regulars to more than 900 degrees, which can be done by concentrated solar radiation. Aluminum. Anorthite can be extracted from anorthosite, which makes up the lunar highlands, then go through the FFC Cambridge process, which involves pressing anorthite into a cathode and creating a voltage difference between the oxide components. This will lead to the explosion of oxygen, which leaves us with aluminum. So although it is possible to get both oxygen and aluminum on the lunar surface, this type of combination is still not mature enough and definitely requires more testing. Nevertheless, it is probably the best option we can get on the moon's surface so far. So overall, for a shorter mission to Mars, it is not necessary to include the moon. However, it might be helpful when it comes to the long-term mission. So in summary, we have examined various mission profiles which can be used to get to Mars, including direct flight using the moon as its flight base and refueling on Mars itself. It turned out that though none of these alternative approaches can reduce cost or entropy for a shorter mission, they might prove to be helpful for long-term missions. Thanks you all for listening.
That was a terrific talk. I really enjoyed it. So we can now throw the forum open to any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. At some stage, you talked about a specific impulse.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite understand what you meant.
Is it here?
You said that that had a much higher specific impulse.
It had a much higher specific impulse compared to what you had presented the slide before. Was that it? I did. So anyway, I got a bit confused there.
I think that's compared to like any other combinations.
Oh, okay. Okay. So it was the optimum specific impulse for that particular mixture then. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
So you're talking about methane versus or methane and oxygen versus liquid and hydrogen?
That's for
chemical rockets, I think.
for chemical rockets,
yeah.
not for
It is.
rockets, yes.
It is. It's for chemical rockets.
Okay.
So you mentioned nuclear power. So you have 10 kilowatts. Is that electric power or thermal? Nuclear has quite a bit of waste heat. So I was just curious if you'd considered using the waste heat from the nuclear in your calculation.
That's a really good point. I did not think of it before.
This is, I checked, so this is a 10 kilowatt electric. This is not thermal. This is 10 kilowatt electric, maximum.
That makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay, so there's probably a lot more kilowatts in thermal that could perhaps be
43 kilowatt in thermal.
43.
Yes.
Shit, so you could use that for a lot of the preliminary heating.
Yeah, and that's pretty typical performance.
Well, that's a good point. We can look into that when we get the whole system operating.
I had one other question. If no one else has. So you talked about different kinds of transfer orbits.
Okay.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about chemical propulsion, but then at the end you talked about electric propulsion. So my question was just going to be if you'd consider or seen anything in the literature about doing a continuous burn for the opposition mission, because you'll be much closer to the sun, so you'll have more solar available power.
Do you mean that the opposition mission actually depends on the electrical propulsion, but not the chemical field?
No. So you described the Holloman transfer orbit and doing two burns that were essentially an impulse. What about the case when you have electric propulsion, where you might be running the engine or the motor for not an impulse, but an extended period of time?
For this part, I think I didn't consider electric propulsion in this case. So for the direct Mars process, I only consider the chemical fuel.
Maybe the comment was also about, I don't know if you've heard about the Bepi Colombo mission to Mercury. BP Colombo. So anyway, for deep space missions, what people tend to do these days is they tend to combine chemical engines with electrical engines, so that depending on which phase of the mission they are at, they use either chemical propulsion or electrical propulsion. So, for example, there would be some, but I don't know if they follow this kind of trends of transfers. I don't know, but they would, for each part of their trajectory, they would try and see if it's better to use a chemical engine or an electrical engine. And so, usually for deep space, the deep space phase of the mission, they would use electrical engines. So they are powered pretty much all the time. It's a continuous thrust, but they use very little amount of fuel. But you can't use those when you require a lot of thrust. So there's a balance between specific impulse and thrust. So, but I think the modern way of doing space travel assessment is to combine different types of engines. So combine chemical rockets and electrical rockets. So what would be useful, for example, in the future is perhaps specify for each calculation if that's taken into account or not. And so perhaps this opposition thing can be further improved by considering electrical rockets. I've got no idea. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I haven't considered that before, and I think it is really good to also compare to that.
Well, the good thing about that would be that if you could get water, you could use that as a propellant for the electrical propulsion on Mars. And then instead of having a 2-burn Hohmann transfer, you'd have a continuous burn all the way and basically a geodesic, still using the sun. And you'd increase the amount of solar power into the panels by a considerable amount. It's a different profile, but it's worth thinking. Good idea, Christine. Any further questions?
Yes, so I have a question about when you calculate the food for the having so where you were calculating getting the food, water, and things like that from Mars. So you said that 50 days on Mars is not enough to make any food. That's right. But what about those duration during the flight? Can we consider making food when you are moving from Earth to Mars or return? Is it feasible to do it or not?
Do you mean that we can make food on the way we get there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's possible. That's possible. If you refer to the robo mission, we can definitely send a robot factory to also grow plants on Mars. But I think the problem is that the soil on Mars contains, I'm not quite sure about that, but a level of radioactivity. And I think that should be first resolved. And since the food that need to consumed by a standard manned mission, which only involves 3 astronauts, is not quite like considerable. So I think maybe bringing it just save some like be more convenient, since we will still have to deal with the radioactivity on the soil and make like a complete ecosystem on Mars.
I think what Marty is saying is that you bring some bushes with you, and then you, on the spaceship, you use human waste like Matt Damon does to fertilize the bushes, which would have the advantage that you wouldn't have to scrub the CO2 because the leaves would take the CO2 and convert it into carbon polymers.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that is possible. Yeah, it's a very good idea.
Yeah. The colonisation spaceships. It's a bit difficult to
I've
do
got a
all.
question too, if you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's more of a philosophical question. Given all the work you've done studying the methods and the cost, is it to send a couple of people to Mars or not? Is it worth the trouble?
Well, from my point of view, I would say no, probably.
Well, that was one of the points. So yes, I totally agree. But you know, people at the moment politically want to put people on Mars, so we have to find out whether it's feasible or not. There are some people we could send to Mars one way. I've got a whole list of people for that.
But it's likely that if we make it to Mars, the first people, there will be dead bodies very quickly. So we may want to just bring dead bodies using robots.
Thank you, Christine. That's really
No.
nice.
Yeah, so if people want to claim it's their first thing to Mars, you can do that as well, right?
That's a very interesting line of thought. Thank you.
How does this cost compare to the Apollo program, adjusted for inflation?
Compared to Apollo program,
That was getting man to the moon.
yeah, I heard about that. I'm not sure the cost for the Apollo program. I can search it now.
Well, how much did it cost the Chinese to get to the dark side of the moon? That must have been a few billion won.
Yeah, I think that was a billion based. Oh, that's actually like 20 billion.
Okay, so it's good value then, what you've calculated.
Yeah, but because that refers to the SpaceX Falcon 9, where they say they can they have a minimum value, and I think that's probably not that minimum.
But that's a good point, Josh. I think that if we went further, we'd need to compare it to other space shots and also compare it to putting up hospitals.
Anyway, $28 billion to get to the moon and back is a figure that is quoted on the internet for the NASA mission.
I saw that. Thank you.
I think it depends on how much of NASA you decide to charge to the mission. You know, how many people, man hours, all that sort of thing. And I think that the Yuan's costs were just simply for the bill of materials. It's distinct from the bill of the whole NASA or Bezos or Elon Musk enterprise administration.
Yeah, but there are lots of things that are much cheaper to do these days compared to then.
Yeah, go down the
A lot
coast.
cheaper, so there will be a huge benefit, technological benefit, basically.
Yeah, so I guess it's the comparison between actually going to the moon, which is the Chinese were the last one. So we'd need to find out a price per kilo on that and work from there. Anyway, I think I'd like to thank you very much. I think that was a really fascinating and intriguing talk to give for a student project. So once again, if we could all unmute and give us a nice round of applause for Yiyue, and congratulations. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yiyue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.